George Strait visits a Christian church and gets moved by the story of a humble sister. What he does next brings everyone to tears. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the small farmhouse as Martha Williams clutched the official bank notice in her trembling hands. The words blurred together through her tears, but the message was crystal clear: 30 days to vacate the property that had been her home for 47 years. At 70 years old, she was about to lose everything she and her beloved Johnny had built together. Martha sank into the old wooden rocking chair that Johnny had crafted with his own hands during their second year of marriage. The chair creaked softly as she rocked back and forth, a sound that had become her only companion since Johnny's passing 3 years ago. The silence of the morning was broken only by the distant mooing of cattle from neighboring farms and the gentle rustling of leaves from the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel over their modest home. The farmhouse itself told the story of their life together. Every weathered board, every carefully tended flower bed, every photograph hanging on. The walls spoke of decades of love, struggle, and perseverance. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Johnny's favorite coffee, and his cowboy hat still hung on the hook by the front door, exactly where he had left it on that terrible day when the ambulance took him away for the last time. Martha closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to happier times. She could almost hear Johnny's deep, melodious voice singing along to the radio as he worked in the barn. He had been a man of simple pleasures and profound faith, a Vietnam veteran who had traded his military uniform for work boots and overalls without ever losing the discipline and honor that had defined his service to his country. "Honey, come, listen to this." She could almost hear him calling from the living room, where he would sit every evening after dinner, tuning in to the local country music station. Their favorite moments together were those quiet evenings when George Strait's voice would fill their small home, and Johnny would extend his calloused hand to her, inviting her to dance in the space between the coffee table and the fireplace. Those impromptu dances to songs like "I Cross My Heart" and "Troubadour" had become the soundtrack of their marriage, a beautiful melody that had sustained them through good times and bad. Now, as Martha sat alone with the foreclosure notice, she wondered how she had reached this desperate point. The answer was written in the stack of medical bills that covered their dining room table like fallen leaves. Johnny's battle with cancer had been long and expensive, draining their modest savings account with the relentless hunger of a prairie fire. Insurance had covered some costs, but the experimental treatments, the travel to specialist doctors, the medications that promised hope but delivered only temporary reprieve, all of it had accumulated into a mountain of debt that now threatened to bury her. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling the weight of Martha's struggle, we invite you to join our community by subscribing to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. Your stories and perspectives enrich our shared journey of discovering these incredible tales of human resilience and unexpected kindness that remind us of the goodness that still exists in this world. After Johnny's funeral, Martha had tried everything to keep the farm afloat. She had sold Johnny's vintage truck, his collection of tools, even some of her grandmother's antique jewelry. She had started a small business selling homemade preserves and fresh vegetables from their garden at the local farmers' market every Saturday. The income was meager, but it had given her purpose and a small sense of independence during the darkest period of her life. The neighbors had been kind at first. Jim Patterson from the adjoining property had helped with the heavier farm work without being asked, and his wife Susan had brought casseroles and fresh bread during those first few months of grief. But as time passed and Martha's financial situation became more desperate, the community's initial outpouring of support had gradually diminished. People had their own problems, their own families to worry about, and Martha understood that she couldn't rely on charity forever. The drought of the past 2 summers had been the final blow. The small vegetable garden that had provided both food for her table and modest income from market sales had withered under the relentless Texas sun. The old well that had served the property for generations had run nearly dry, and Martha couldn't afford the thousands of dollars it would cost to drill a new one. She had watched helplessly as her tomatoes shriveled on the vine, and her beloved flower garden became a monument to her growing desperation. The bank had been patient at first, extending payment deadlines and reducing monthly amounts when she explained her situation. But patience, Martha had learned, was a finite resource in the world of business. The new manager, a young man in an expensive suit who looked at her property as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet, had made it clear that sentiment had no place in banking. "Mrs. Williams," he had said during their last meeting, his voice devoid of any warmth or understanding, "we've been more than generous with our accommodations. It's time to face reality." Reality. The word echoed in Martha's mind as she looked out over the land that held every precious memory of her life with Johnny. The small barn where they had kept their horses, the vegetable garden where they had worked side by side every spring, the porch where they had spent countless evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. This wasn't just property to be liquidated. It was the foundation of everything they had built together, the sacred ground where their love story had unfolded over nearly 5 decades. As the morning wore on, Martha found herself walking through the house, touching the things that would soon be lost forever. In the bedroom, she paused at Johnny's dresser, where his Purple Heart medal still rested in its place of honor. He had never talked much about his service in Vietnam, but she knew the memories haunted him sometimes, especially during thunderstorms that reminded him of artillery fire. The medal represented not just his sacrifice for his country, but his quiet strength in facing life's challenges with dignity and grace. In the kitchen, she opened the recipe box that held 3 generations of family cooking secrets. Her grandmother's handwriting on yellowed index cards, her mother's modifications scrawled in the margins, and her own additions from years of experimentation and refinement. These recipes weren't just instructions for making food. They were the threads that connected her to her heritage, the tangible links to women who had faced their own hardships with resilience and faith. The living room held the most precious memories of all. The old record player where Johnny used to play his Strait albums, the comfortable couch where they had spent countless evenings reading together, the windows that framed the view of their land like a living painting that changed with the seasons. This room had witnessed their children's first steps, family Christmas mornings, quiet conversations about dreams and fears, and the tender moments of a marriage that had weathered every storm life had thrown their way. Martha knew that tomorrow would bring another day of impossible choices. She could continue to fight a battle that seemed increasingly hopeless, or she could begin the heartbreaking process of preparing to leave the only home she had ever truly known. But today, in this moment of profound sadness and uncertainty, she made a decision that would change everything. She would go to church this Sunday, and she would share her story with the congregation. Not to ask for help, her pride wouldn't allow that, but to give testimony to the faithfulness that had sustained her through the darkest valley of her life. As she rocked in Johnny's chair, Martha began to hum softly to herself. The melody was familiar, comforting, one of those Strait songs that had provided the soundtrack to their life together. She didn't know that in just a few days, the man whose voice had been the constant companion of her marriage would walk into her small church and hear her story. She couldn't imagine that her testimony of loss and perseverance would touch the heart of the king of country music himself, setting in motion a chain of events that would not only save her farm, but transform the lives of everyone involved. The following Monday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror Martha's growing anxiety. She had spent the weekend preparing for what she knew would be her final attempt to negotiate with the bank. Her best dress, the navy blue one, with tiny flowers that Johnny had always said brought out the color in her eyes, hung pressed and ready in her closet. She had practiced her speech in front of the bathroom mirror, rehearsing the words that might somehow convey the depth of her desperation without sacrificing the dignity that Johnny had always said was her most beautiful quality. First National. Bank of San Antonio stood like a fortress of glass and steel in the heart of the business district, its imposing facade designed to project stability and prosperity. Martha felt small and out of place as she walked through the revolving doors, her worn leather purse clutched tightly in her hands. The lobby hummed with the quiet efficiency of modern banking. Muted conversations, the soft clicking of computer keyboards, and the occasional ring of telephones that seemed to emphasize how far removed this world was from her simple farm life. "Mrs. Williams, Mr. Davidson will see you now," announced the receptionist, a young woman with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Martha followed her down a hallway lined with photographs of the bank's board of directors, stern-faced men in expensive suits who seemed to stare down at her with cold judgment. Richard Davidson's office was a monument to corporate success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while his massive mahogany desk was adorned with awards, family photographs, and what appeared to be a very expensive pen set. Davidson himself was younger than Martha had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of confidence that came from never having faced real hardship. His handshake was firm but brief, and he gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk without offering the courtesy of eye contact. "Mrs. Williams, I appreciate you coming in today, but I'm afraid my position hasn't changed since our last conversation," Davidson began, his tone suggesting that this meeting was an inconvenience he was barely willing to tolerate. "The bank has been more than patient with your situation, but we're not a charity organization. We have shareholders to answer to, and frankly, your account represents a significant liability." Martha felt her throat tighten, but she forced herself to speak with the calm dignity that Johnny had always admired. "Mr. Davidson, I understand the bank's position, but I'm hoping we can work out some kind of arrangement. I've brought a business plan," she said, removing a handwritten document from her purse. "I believe I can make the property profitable again if I could just get a little more time." Davidson glanced at the papers she had spent hours preparing, without really seeing them. "Mrs. Williams, with all due respect, you're 70 years old. The agricultural market is challenging even for experienced commercial farmers with significant capital investment. What you're proposing here," he gestured dismissively at her carefully crafted plans, "is simply not realistic." "But this land has been productive for generations," Martha insisted, her voice gaining strength as she thought about Johnny and all the dreams they had shared. "My husband and I raised 4 children here. We grew enough food to feed our family and sell at market. We maintained a small but sustainable operation for decades. The drought has been devastating, yes, but droughts end, with proper irrigation and maybe some modernization of the equipment." "Mrs. Williams," Davidson interrupted, his impatience now clearly visible, "I think you're not grasping the reality of your situation. The mortgage is 3 months in arrears, the property taxes are overdue, and based on our assessment, the land value has decreased significantly due to the ongoing water issues in the region. Even if we were to restructure the loan, which, frankly, isn't something I'm prepared to recommend to the board, you simply don't have the income potential to service the debt." Martha felt tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall in front of this cold, calculating man. "What if I could find co-signers? My children, they're all doing well. They might be willing to." "Your children have made it clear they're not interested in assuming responsibility for this debt," Davidson said, consulting a file on his desk. We've already been in contact with them. Your son David was quite explicit about his family's position." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. She knew her children had their own financial pressures. David, with his young family and new mortgage, Sarah with her husband's recent medical issues, and the twins trying to establish their own careers. But she hadn't realized they had already been contacted by the bank. The thought that they had discussed her situation without involving her felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any financial loss. "I see," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. She sat in silence for a moment, gathering her composure before continuing. "Mr. Davidson, this farm isn't just a piece of property to me. It's where I buried 3 generations of my family. It's where my husband came home from war and learned to find peace again. It's where my children took their first steps and learned the value of hard work and honest living. Surely that must count for something." Davidson's expression softened slightly, but his words remained unchanged. "Mrs. Williams, I understand this is emotional for you, but sentiment doesn't pay mortgages. The bank has a fiduciary responsibility to its investors. Frankly, at your age, you might want to consider that this could be an opportunity for a fresh start. There are some very nice assisted living facilities in the area, places where you wouldn't have the burden of maintaining a property or worrying about finances." The suggestion hung in the air like a slap. Assisted living facilities, places where elderly people went to wait for death, surrounded by strangers who knew nothing about their lives, their loves, their losses. Martha thought about Johnny's promise, that they would grow old together on their land, watching the seasons change from their front porch, tending their garden until the Lord called them home. "Mr. Davidson," Martha said, standing with a dignity that surprised even herself, "I may be 70 years old, but I'm not ready for a rocking chair in some institutional facility. And I'm certainly not ready to abandon everything my husband and I built together just because it's convenient for your shareholders." Davidson also stood, clearly indicating that the meeting was over. "Mrs. Williams, the foreclosure proceedings will begin next week. You have until the 15th of next month to vacate the property. I'm sorry, but that's final." As Martha walked out of the bank, her legs felt unsteady and her heart raced with a combination of humiliation and desperate determination. The 30-minute drive back to the farm passed in a blur of tears and fragmented thoughts. She had known the meeting was unlikely to change anything, but experiencing such callous dismissal of her life's work had been more devastating than she had anticipated. That evening, as if the universe wanted to add insult to injury, the weather took a dramatic turn. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain that should have been welcome after months of drought. But Martha knew from experience that, after such a dry spell, sudden heavy rainfall could be as destructive as the drought itself. She spent the night listening to the wind howl around the house and watching lightning illuminate the sky through her bedroom window. By morning, the storm had passed, but its aftermath was worse than Martha had feared. The old oak tree that had stood sentinel over their property for generations had been struck by lightning, its massive trunk split down the middle. Half of the tree had crashed into the barn roof, creating a gaping hole that would cost thousands of dollars to repair, money she simply didn't have. The vegetable garden she had been trying to revive was flooded and destroyed, and several of the fence posts that marked her property line had been knocked down by falling branches. Standing in the mud of what had once been her garden, Martha felt the weight of defeat settling over her like a heavy blanket. Everything she had tried to preserve was slipping away, and she was powerless to stop it. For the first time since Johnny's death, she allowed herself to truly break down, sobbing openly as she surveyed the destruction that seemed to mirror the ruins of her life. It was Jim Patterson who found her there an hour later, still standing in the muddy garden with tears streaming down her face. "Martha, honey, I saw the tree from the road," he said, his voice gentle with concern. "Susan sent me over to check. On you. Are you hurt?" Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed to be seen in such a state. "I'm fine, Jim. Just surveying the damage. It looks worse than it is, I'm sure." But even as she spoke the words, both of them knew she was lying. Jim walked around the property with her, assessing the storm damage with the eye of someone who had been farming for 40 years. His expression grew more troubled with each new discovery, and Martha could see him mentally calculating repair costs that would be astronomical for someone in her position. "Martha," Jim said finally, his voice heavy with uncomfortable truth, "this is going to require some serious work. The barn roof alone will cost 15, maybe 20,000 to fix properly. And that tree, removing what's left of it and clearing the debris, that's another big expense." Martha nodded, feeling numb. "I know, Jim, I know. Have you thought about maybe it's time to—" Jim struggled to find words that wouldn't hurt her feelings. "Maybe this is the Lord's way of telling you it's time for a new chapter." Even her closest neighbor, the man who had been Johnny's best friend and had helped them through countless crises over the years, was suggesting she give up. Martha felt a loneliness so profound it was almost physically painful. "Maybe so, Jim, maybe so." That evening, as Martha sat in Johnny's rocking chair, looking out over the damaged property, she made a decision that would change the course of her life. This Sunday, she would go to church, and she would share her testimony with the congregation. Not to ask for help, her pride still wouldn't allow that, but to thank them for their friendship and to say goodbye to the community that had been her family for so many years. She had no way of knowing that her decision to speak that Sunday would bring a visitor to their small church, someone whose presence would transform not just her life, but the lives of everyone who heard her story. As she prepared for what she believed would be her final testimony in the church, where she and Johnny had been married, where they had dedicated their children, and where they had celebrated and mourned together for nearly 5 decades, Martha couldn't imagine that the voice that had provided the soundtrack to her marriage was about to walk through those familiar doors and change everything. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the storm that had ravaged Martha's property just days before. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her best dress, the same navy blue one she had worn to the bank, but somehow it felt different today. Today it wasn't armor for battle, it was a testament to the dignity Johnny had always said she possessed, even in her darkest moments. Grace Community Church sat on a small hill overlooking the countryside, its white steeple visible for miles around. The building itself was modest, seating perhaps 150 people on a good Sunday, but it had been the spiritual heart of the community for over 70 years. Martha and Johnny had attended services here every Sunday for 46 years, sitting in the same pew, 4th row from the front left side, where they had held hands during prayers and shared hymnal during songs. As Martha drove her aging sedan into the church parking lot, she noticed several unfamiliar vehicles, including a large black SUV with tinted windows parked discreetly near the back of the building. She assumed it belonged to visitors from one of the larger congregations in San Antonio, perhaps relatives visiting local members. The thought that someone famous might be in attendance never crossed her mind. Inside the church, Pastor Robert Henderson was making his final preparations for the morning service. A man in his mid-60s with kind eyes and graying hair, Pastor Henderson had shepherded this small flock for nearly 20 years. He had officiated at Johnny's funeral, had counseled Martha through her darkest days of grief, and had watched her struggle with dignity through the financial crisis that now threatened to uproot her from everything she held dear. "Martha, I'm so glad you're here," Pastor Henderson said, approaching her as she settled into her usual pew. Are you still planning to share your testimony this morning? Martha nodded, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. Yes, Pastor. I think it's time. What Martha didn't see was the tall figure in worn jeans and a simple button-down shirt who had slipped through the back entrance of the church just minutes before the service began. George Strait had arrived in San Antonio the night before for a benefit concert scheduled for Monday evening, and true to his lifelong habit, he had sought out a small local church where he could worship without fanfare. His assistant had done research and recommended Grace Community Church as a place where he could attend service peacefully, away from the crowds and cameras that followed his every public appearance. George had specifically requested the back pew, hoping to slip in and out without drawing attention. He wore his everyday clothes rather than his stage attire, and his famous white cowboy hat was left in the SUV. To the casual observer, he looked like any other middle-aged rancher attending Sunday service. Only his assistant, Mike, who sat beside him, knew the identity of the man whose voice had defined country music for over 4 decades. As the service began with familiar hymns, George found himself genuinely moved by the simple faith and warm fellowship of the small congregation. There was something authentic about this place, something that reminded him of his own childhood church in Pearsall, Texas, where his love for music had first been nurtured and his faith had taken root. The voices around him weren't professionally trained, but they sang with a sincerity that touched his heart in ways that even the most elaborate concert performances rarely achieved. Pastor Henderson delivered a brief but heartfelt sermon about perseverance in the face of trials, and George couldn't help but notice how several members of the congregation glanced sympathetically toward a woman sitting alone in the 4th row. There was something about her posture, dignified but weighted with sorrow, that caught his attention and stirred his compassion. Before we close this morning, Pastor Henderson announced, Martha Williams has asked to share a testimony with us. Martha has been a cornerstone of this congregation for decades, and her words always bring wisdom and grace to our fellowship. George watched as the woman from the 4th row slowly made her way to the front of the church. She was older, probably in her 70s, with silver hair neatly arranged and wearing a dress that spoke of careful maintenance rather than recent purchase. But there was something in her bearing, a quiet strength that commanded respect, and George found himself leaning forward with interest. "Thank you, Pastor Henderson," Martha began, her voice soft but clear. "I've been a member of this church family for 46 years, and in all that time, I've shared many testimonies with you. Celebrations of births and marriages, expressions of gratitude for answered prayers, and yes, requests for prayer during difficult times. Today, I'm here to share what may be my final testimony as a member of this congregation." A murmur of concern rippled through the small sanctuary, and George felt a tightness in his chest as he sensed the gravity of what was to come. 3 years ago, many of you attended the funeral of my beloved husband, Johnny, Martha continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Johnny was a Vietnam veteran, a man of faith, and the love of my life for 47 years. Together, we built a life on a small farm just outside of town, raised 4 beautiful children, and created memories that I will treasure until my dying day. George noticed several people in the congregation wiping away tears, and he found himself deeply moved by the obvious love and respect this community had for Martha. After Johnny's passing, I faced challenges I never imagined I would have to handle alone, Martha said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The medical bills from his cancer treatment, the drought that devastated our small farm, the loneliness that sometimes felt like it would swallow me whole. But through it all, I found strength in my faith, in your friendship, and in the music that Johnny and I loved so much. At the mention of music, George felt his attention sharpen. though he couldn't have explained why. "You see, Johnny was the biggest George Strait fan you could imagine," Martha said with a smile that transformed her entire face. "For 47 years, that man serenaded me with George Strait songs. He'd come in from working in the fields, covered in dust and sweat, and he'd turn on the radio and ask me to dance right there in our little kitchen while dinner was cooking on the stove." George felt his breath catch in his throat. In all his years of performing, he had always hoped his music touched people's lives, but hearing this intimate glimpse into how his songs had become part of someone's daily love story was profoundly moving. "I Cross My Heart" was our wedding song, Martha continued, and George could see tears glistening in her eyes. "Johnny said it was the most beautiful promise a man could make to a woman, and he kept that promise every single day of our marriage. Troubadour was the song he'd hum while he worked in the garden, and Carried Away was playing on the radio the day he first kissed me on our front porch swing." George felt tears threatening his own eyes as he listened to this woman describe how the songs he had written and performed had become the soundtrack to one of the most beautiful love stories he had ever heard. Around him, the congregation was completely silent, hanging on Martha's every word. "After Johnny died, I thought the music would be too painful to bear," Martha said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I discovered that those songs weren't reminders of what I had lost. They were celebrations of what I had been blessed to have. When I listened to George Strait sing about love and faithfulness and the simple beauty of a life shared with someone special, I hear Johnny's voice again. I feel his arms around me again. I remember that I was loved completely and without reservation for 47 years, and that is a gift that no one can ever take away from me." George had to look down at his hands to compose himself, overwhelmed by the realization that his music had provided comfort to this grieving woman in ways he had never imagined possible. "I'm sharing this with you today because I want you to know that even though I'm facing the loss of our farm, the place where Johnny and I built our life together, I'm not bitter or angry," Martha said, her voice growing stronger again. "Yes, I'm heartbroken. Yes, I'm scared about what the future holds, but I'm also grateful beyond measure for the love I've known, the friendships I've treasured, and the faith that sustains me even in the darkest valley." The silence in the church was profound as Martha paused to gather her thoughts. George found himself holding his breath, waiting for her next words. "The bank has given me until the 15th of next month to leave the only home I've ever really known," Martha said matter-of-factly. "I don't know where I'll go or what I'll do, but I know that the same God who brought Johnny into my life, who blessed us with 4 beautiful children, and who gave us 47 years of happiness, will provide for whatever comes next." George felt something stirring in his heart, a sense of purpose and calling that he hadn't experienced in years. This woman's story, her grace in the face of devastating loss, her gratitude in the midst of crushing disappointment, it represented everything he believed music should accomplish. His songs had helped her celebrate love, process grief, and find strength to face an uncertain future. "I want to thank all of you for being my family through the good times and the bad," Martha concluded, her voice filled with genuine warmth, despite her tears. "And I want to thank Johnny, wherever he is, for teaching me that love really can last forever, even when the person you love is no longer beside you. The music plays on, the memories live on, and love never truly dies." As Martha returned to her seat, the congregation sat in stunned silence, many openly weeping at the beauty and tragedy of her testimony. George knew in that moment that he couldn't simply sit there and do nothing. This woman's story had touched his heart in a way that demanded action, and he felt a divine calling that he couldn't ignore. Slowly, George stood up from his back pew, his heart pounding with nervous energy and profound purpose. The time for anonymity was over. Martha Williams was about to discover that the voice that had provided the soundtrack to her love story was sitting just 20 feet away, and her testimony was about to set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. A murmur rippled through the congregation as the tall stranger in the back row began walking down the center aisle. Pastor Henderson looked puzzled, unsure whether this was an emergency or an impromptu response to Martha's testimony. Martha herself turned in her seat, curious about the commotion, and found herself looking at a face that seemed familiar, yet impossible. "Excuse me, Pastor Henderson," George said, his distinctive voice immediately recognizable to anyone who had ever listened to country music. "I wonder if I might say a few words." The gasps that echoed through the small church were audible and immediate. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson dropped her hymnal with a loud thud. Jim Patterson's mouth fell open in shock. Even Pastor Henderson seemed momentarily speechless as he realized that one of country music's biggest legends was standing in his humble sanctuary. But it was Martha's reaction that mattered most to George. She sat frozen in her pew, her hand pressed to her heart, staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and wonder that was almost childlike in its innocence. Her lips moved silently, as if she were trying to convince herself that what she was seeing was real. A kick, of course. Pastor Henderson managed, stepping aside to allow George access to the microphone. "Please, by all means." George approached the front of the church with the same humble confidence he brought to concert stages around the world. But this was different. This wasn't about entertaining thousands of fans. This was about honoring one woman's extraordinary story and the role his music had played in her life. "Good morning, everyone," George began, his voice carrying the warmth and sincerity that had endeared him to millions of fans over the decades. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I couldn't sit quietly after hearing Martha's beautiful testimony." Martha's hand flew to her mouth, and tears began streaming down her cheeks as the reality of the situation hit her. The man whose voice had been the soundtrack to her 47-year love story was standing in her church, speaking her name, acknowledging her pain and her loss. "My name is George Strait," he continued, though the introduction was unnecessary for anyone in the room. "I've been blessed to make music for most of my adult life, and I've always hoped that my songs might bring some joy or comfort to people. But I have to tell you, in all my years of performing, I have never been more moved by anything than I was by Martha's testimony this morning." The church was so quiet that the only sounds were Martha's soft sobs and the distant chirping of birds outside the windows. George's assistant Mike sat in the back row, discreetly recording the moment on his phone, knowing instinctively that this was one of those rare, unrehearsable moments that defined a person's character. "Martha," George said, turning to address her directly, "hearing about how my music became part of your love story with Johnny, there are no words for how that makes me feel. To know that I Cross My Heart was your wedding song, that Troubadour was something Johnny hummed while he worked, that my music helped you celebrate 47 years of love and is now helping you process your grief. That's the greatest honor any songwriter could ever receive." Martha tried to speak, but could only nod through her tears. The congregation sat transfixed, witnessing something that felt more like a miracle than a coincidence. "But I'm not just here to thank you for sharing your story," George continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "I'm here because what's happening to you is wrong, and I want to help make it right." Pastor Henderson moved closer, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Around the church, people were pulling out cell phones, instinctively knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for generations. "I heard you say that the bank is forcing you to leave your farm by the 15th of next month," George said, his tone shifting to one of quiet determination. The place where you and Johnny built your life together, where you raised your children, where 47 years of love and memories live in every corner, that's not just property, that's sacred ground, and it deserves to be protected. Martha finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. Mr. Strait, I can't believe you're really here. Johnny would be. He would be so. I think Johnny is here, George said gently, gesturing around the church. I think he's in every memory you shared, in every song that still makes you smile, in the love that continues to live in your heart. And I think he'd want me to make sure you get to keep the home where that love flourished. The emotional impact of George's words was palpable. Several members of the congregation were openly weeping, and even Pastor Henderson had to wipe his eyes with his handkerchief. Martha, I want to make you an offer, George said, his business instincts combining with his compassionate heart to form a plan that was both practical and profound. I want to buy your farm's mortgage from the bank and restructure it in a way that allows you to stay in your home for as long as you want. But more than that, I want to help you turn your property into something special, a place that honors the kind of love you and Johnny shared and the music that brought us all together. The congregation erupted in gasps and whispers. This was beyond anything anyone could have imagined when they woke up that Sunday morning. I'm thinking about a small venue, George continued, his excitement growing as the vision took shape in his mind. Nothing too big or commercial, just an intimate space where people can come to hear authentic country music, where young artists can perform for appreciative audiences, where families can bring their children to learn about the traditions that made this music special. We could call it Johnny's Place, in honor of your husband's service and the love he had for this music. Martha stood up slowly, her legs shaking with emotion and disbelief. Mr. Strait, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly accept. Yes, you can, George said firmly but kindly. And you will, because this isn't just about charity. This is about preserving something important, something that your testimony this morning reminded me we're in danger of losing. In a world that's becoming more and more disconnected, your farm represents the kind of authentic community and genuine love that country music was built to celebrate. George's assistant Mike was already on his phone, calling attorneys and financial advisors, knowing that when George Strait made a commitment like this, the machinery to make it happen needed to start moving immediately. But first, George said, his expression hardening with determination, I want to have a conversation with the people at the bank who thought they could just throw you out of your home without any consideration for what it means to you. Would you mind if I drove you there tomorrow morning? Martha looked around the church at the faces of her friends and neighbors, all of whom were staring at her with expressions of joy and amazement. Yes, I suppose that would be all right. Good, George said with a smile that was equal parts warmth and steel, because I have a few things I'd like to say to Mr. Davidson about how his bank treats its customers, especially customers who have given their whole lives to this community. Pastor Henderson stepped forward, still somewhat stunned by the morning's events. Mr. Strait, would you be willing to sing something for us? I know it's not why you came, but... George looked at Martha, who nodded eagerly, through her tears. I think that would be perfect, he said. Martha, would you mind joining me? I have a feeling you know the words to most of my songs better than I do. What happened next was something that no one in Grace Community Church would ever forget. George Strait, one of the most successful recording artists in the history of country music, and Martha Williams, a 70-year-old widow facing the loss of everything she held dear, stood together at the front of a small rural church and sang I Cross My Heart, the song that had been her wedding song 47 years earlier. Martha's voice, though untrained and shaky with emotion, blended beautifully with George's familiar baritone. As they sang about love that lasts forever and promises that never break, it felt as though Johnny Williams himself was present in that sanctuary, blessing the unlikely friendship that was forming between his beloved wife and the artist whose music had defined their relationship. When the song ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. But more than that, there was a sense that something miraculous had just occurred. Not just the appearance of a country music legend in their midst, but the birth of a plan that would save Martha's farm and create something beautiful from the ashes of her loss. "Martha," George said as the last notes faded away, "I want you to know that this is just the beginning. Tomorrow, we're going to make some people very uncomfortable with their business practices. By next week, we're going to have architects and contractors drawing up plans for Johnny's place. And by next month, instead of packing up to leave your home, you're going to be preparing to welcome visitors who want to experience the kind of authentic hospitality and genuine community that you and Johnny spent 47 years building." As George prepared to leave the church, promising to pick Martha up at 9 o'clock the next morning for their visit to the bank, neither of them could have imagined how dramatically their confrontation with Richard Davidson would unfold, or how quickly word of George Strait's intervention would spread throughout the country music community and beyond. The battle for Martha's farm was about to become much more than a simple real estate dispute. It was about to become a very public test of whether compassion and community could triumph over cold corporate calculation. But first, George had some phone calls to make and some very important people to put on notice that the king of country music was about to remind a certain bank exactly what customer service was supposed to look like. Monday morning arrived with an energy that Martha had not felt in years. She stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the same navy blue dress that had carried her through both defeat and unexpected triumph in recent days. But today felt different. Today, she was not walking into that bank alone and powerless. Today, she had an ally whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of her small farming community. George arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, driving a modest pickup truck rather than the luxury SUV from the day before. "I thought we'd take something that would feel more comfortable to you," he explained with a warm smile as Martha climbed into the passenger seat. "Besides, I want Mr. Davidson to see exactly the kind of people he's been treating so poorly." The drive to the bank was filled with comfortable conversation as George asked Martha about her children, her years on the farm, and her memories of Johnny. What struck Martha most was how genuinely interested he seemed in her answers, how he listened with the same attention he might give to a music producer or a fellow artist. She began to understand that George Strait's reputation for being a good man was built on moments like these, when cameras weren't rolling and crowds weren't cheering. "Martha, I want you to know that whatever happens in there today, your farm is safe," George said as they pulled into the bank's parking lot. "I've already had my attorneys contact the bank's legal department this morning. The paperwork to transfer your mortgage to my management company is being prepared as we speak. But I still want Davidson to explain himself, and I want him to understand the human cost of his decisions." Word of George Strait's involvement had somehow leaked overnight, and a small crowd of reporters and curious onlookers had gathered outside First National Bank. As George and Martha walked toward the entrance, cameras flashed and questions were shouted, but George skillfully guided Martha through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to public attention. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was palpably tense. Employees whispered among themselves and stared openly as George Strait walked through their lobby. The receptionist, who had been so dismissive of Martha just days before now, stammered nervously as she announced their arrival to Mr. Davidson's office. Richard Davidson emerged from his office with a forced smile and an extended hand, clearly hoping to manage what he now understood was a public relations disaster in the making. "Mr. Strait, this is such an unexpected honor. I'm Richard Davidson, Senior Vice President of Lending. I understand there may have been some confusion about Mrs. Williams's situation. George did not take the offered handshake. Instead, he looked Davidson directly in the eyes with an expression that was polite but unmistakably serious. Mr. Davidson, there's been no confusion at all. I understand the situation perfectly. You've been trying to foreclose on the home of a 70-year-old widow whose husband served his country in Vietnam and who has been a productive member of this community for nearly 5 decades. What I don't understand is how you sleep at night. Davidson's face flushed red as he realized this was not going to be the celebrity meet and greet he had hoped for. Mr. Strait, I think perhaps we should discuss this privately in my office. Actually, I think this conversation should be as public as possible, George replied, his voice carrying clearly through the bank lobby where employees and customers had stopped what they were doing to listen. Mrs. Williams shouldn't have to hide her head in shame because your bank decided that 47 years of community membership and timely payments meant nothing the moment she faced a medical crisis. Martha stood beside George, drawing strength from his presence and his willingness to advocate for her in a way that no one had done since Johnny's death. She watched Davidson squirm uncomfortably as George continued his very public dressing down. You know what I find most interesting. Mr. Davidson, George continued, his tone remaining conversational but his words cutting deep. I've done some research on your bank's lending practices, and it seems like Mrs. Williams isn't the only long-time customer you've treated this way. There's a pattern here of targeting elderly customers during their most vulnerable moments. Davidson looked around nervously, realizing that several customers were recording the conversation on their phones. Mr. Strait, I assure you that First National Bank follows all applicable regulations and— Regulations, George interrupted, shaking his head. You know what, Mr. Davidson? Sometimes the right thing to do has nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with basic human decency. Martha Williams has been banking here longer than you've been alive, and when she needed compassion, you offered her a suggestion to move to an assisted living facility. The crowd that had gathered in the lobby gasped audibly. Several elderly customers looked particularly shocked and offended by this revelation. Mr. Strait, if you would just give me a chance to explain our position, Davidson began desperately. Your position is perfectly clear, George said firmly. Your position is that profit matters more than people, that shareholder returns are more important than community relationships, and that a woman who helped build this town deserves to lose everything when she faces circumstances beyond her control. At that moment, George's assistant Mike appeared at his side and whispered something in his ear. George nodded and smiled for the first time since entering the bank. Mr. Davidson, I have some good news for you, George announced loudly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. As of 30 minutes ago, Mrs. Williams's mortgage has been purchased by Strait Management LLC. She will no longer be subject to your bank's foreclosure proceedings or your particular brand of customer service. The lobby erupted in applause, led by bank employees who had clearly been uncomfortable with their institution's treatment of Martha. Davidson stood frozen, realizing that he had not only lost a customer, but had created a public relations nightmare that would follow him for the rest of his career. But here's what I want you to remember, Mr. Davidson, George said, leaning in closer to the banker. Every decision you make affects real people with real lives and real feelings. Mrs. Williams isn't a number on a spreadsheet. She's a human being who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. I hope this experience teaches you something about the kind of banker and the kind of man you want to be. As they left the bank, Martha felt a lightness in her, a step that she hadn't experienced in years. George, she said as they walked toward his truck, I still can't believe this is really happening. Martha, this is just the beginning, George replied with genuine excitement. "Now we get to the fun part. We're going to build something beautiful on your farm, something that honors Johnny's memory and creates jobs for your community. But first, we have a concert to plan." The benefit concert that George organized for the following weekend became one of the most talked-about events in Texas music history. Word spread quickly through the country music community about Martha's story and George's intervention, and artists began volunteering to perform without compensation. The concert would be held on Martha's property, with all proceeds going to establish a fund for military veterans facing financial hardship. The day of the concert dawned perfect and clear. Martha woke up in her own bedroom in the farmhouse, where she had spent 47 years with Johnny, knowing that she would never have to leave. Workers had spent the week preparing her property for the event, setting up a temporary stage in the pasture where Johnny used to graze their cattle, arranging seating for nearly 2,000 people, and creating an atmosphere that felt more like a family reunion than a commercial concert. As the afternoon wore on, and performers took the stage one by one, Martha found herself surrounded by new friends from the music industry who had been moved by her story. But the moment she had been both anticipating and dreading came when George called her name from the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," George announced to the crowd, "I want you to meet someone very special. Martha Williams is the reason we're all here today, and her testimony yesterday reminded me why I fell in love with country music in the first place. Martha, would you join me up here? Walking onto that stage in front of 2,000 people should have been terrifying for a 70-year-old farm wife who had never performed for anyone beyond her church congregation. But as Martha took George's hand and stood beside him in front of the microphone, she felt Johnny's presence as strongly, as if he were standing right behind her. "Martha and I are going to sing a song that means a lot to both of us," George told the crowd. "It was her wedding song 47 years ago, and yesterday in church, it became the song that brought us together." As George began the opening, notes of the song that had defined Martha and Johnny's relationship, something magical happened. Martha's voice, strengthened by emotion and supported by the love of the crowd, blended perfectly with George's familiar baritone. Together, they sang about promises that last forever and love that never dies, and in that moment, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than a performance. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous and sustained, but more than that, there was a sense of healing, of justice restored, and of community coming together to protect one of its own. Martha looked out over the crowd and saw faces wet with tears, people standing and cheering, not just for the music, but for the triumph of compassion over indifference. Johnny's Place opened 6 months later, built on the site where the benefit concert had taken place. The venue hosted intimate acoustic concerts, songwriting workshops for aspiring musicians, and monthly gatherings where local families could bring their children to learn about the traditions that made country music special. Martha became the venue's hostess and unofficial historian, sharing stories about the music and the artists who performed there. But perhaps the most meaningful addition to the property was the small memorial garden that George had commissioned in Johnny's honor. A simple stone bench sat under the restored oak tree, with an inscription that read, "In memory of Johnny Williams, Vietnam veteran, devoted husband, and music lover. His love story continues in every song." On quiet evenings, Martha would sit on that bench and listen to the music drifting from Johnny's Place, surrounded by the sounds of laughter, applause, and young voices learning the songs that had shaped their heritage. Sometimes she would close her eyes and imagine Johnny sitting beside her, his hand in hers, both of them marveling at how their simple love story had grown into something that brought joy to so many people. The farm that had once faced foreclosure became a destination for music lovers from around the world, a place where authentic country music was celebrated and preserved. Martha's story of loss and redemption became legendary in the country music community, a reminder that the best songs are those that spring from real life, real love, and real loss. And sometimes, on special occasions, George Strait would return to Johnny's place for intimate concerts where he and Martha would sing together again, their voices blending in songs about love that lasts forever and promises that never break. In those moments, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something sacred, the power of music to heal hearts, build communities, and transform lives in ways that go far beyond entertainment. Martha Williams never did move to an assisted living facility. She lived on her beloved farm until she was 91 years old, surrounded by the music, the memories, and the love that had sustained her through the darkest valley of her life. And when she finally joined Johnny in whatever comes after this life, Johnny's place continued to operate as a testament to their love story and a reminder that sometimes, when all seems lost, extraordinary angels appear in the most unexpected ways to restore hope and prove that love really can last forever.